You are listening to Gospel of Peace, a podcast for kingdom women and everyone else about political theology and everyday faith. I'm your host, Rebecca, and today I am joined by two other team members from the Kingdom Outpost, kingdomoutpost.org, Ray and Abram. Ray and Abram are both conservative Mennonites, and we are going to be talking about masculinity and the gospel of peace today. So I'm going to get you guys to introduce yourselves. Let's start with Ray.
Yeah, my name is Ray Weaver. I grew up here in Lancaster County, where I still live. Grew up in horse and buggy Mennonite Grafto Conference family, 5th of 12 kids, so pretty large, but even by Mennonite standards. Yeah, that should get you a little bit up to speed on my Mennonite cred. I don't know if there's anything else you need to know, but we'll take it from there.
Awesome. And Abram, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I hail from the great Republic of Texas. I grew up in Western New York State as also part of an Old Order community, Old Order Mennonite, and currently I'm still part of a conservative Mennonite church and community here. And I'm the oldest of 10 children, and and my parents would still be Old Order Mennonite. So yeah, I'm excited about this conversation today.
Right. I can't wait to dive in. So all three of us have been reading this book, Zachary Wagner's Non-Toxic Masculinity, Recovering Healthy Male Sexuality. So we are going to be referring to it today. And we want to talk about first, I think let's dive into what are some of the crises in masculinity that's happening today in the Christian world, but also in the wider world. Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest ones I would see is that's outlined in this book. He gets into it is pornography. There's a lot of like online, just I think a lack of purpose for men. I think a lot of young men don't have a sense of purpose. They don't know. They don't have a sense of calling in their life, and so they're just kind of just afloat. Kind of, they're just. And we have also, the statistics on suicide have been going up for young men. The college graduation rate has gone down. So there's also, I think, men in some of those demographics are falling behind a little bit from what they were. And I think some of that is definitely, I would say, a fruit of this kind of lack of purpose. And therefore, I would say one of the crises has been in order to find that purpose, young men have been seeking out extremist figures such as Andrew Tate or other kind of right-wing manosphere. Even right wing's not really, just like far right manosphere type figures that promote their stuff through podcasts and YouTube channels. And I think a lot of young men, they listen to that, and it gives them a sense of belonging to something and a sense of purpose. And a lot of times, because they blame feminism for all the ills that men face, it gives them an enemy to fight against, kind of. And so that's where they get their sense of purpose. And I don't think that's healthy. So that's, I think there needs to be the church, and especially the gospel of the kingdom. We need to be looking at how can we take some of those challenges that young men are facing and offer them a different vision than what these extremist influencers are offering them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So these sort of extremist influences, would you say that they're more secular, or they're also found within like evangelical or Christian settings?
I mean, it's definitely both. I mean, I think most of them are secular while also using religion as kind of a way to prop up some of their talking points, while others are coming from a more Christian side and are using some of this because it gains them attention and like it attracts viewers to their channels. And so somebody like Doug Wilson, who in a lot of ways hasn't always been in this kind of this sphere. He's been more, kind of the reformdom and some of those other topics in the Christian, theology realm, has really leaned into this in the last number of years because it's a topic that gains him it gains him attraction, it gains him followers. And so I think they've seen an opportunity to kind of spread their message. And so that's I think where some of the divide is. Some of the more manosphere people actually reject Christianity, like Andrew Tate says he has converted to Islam because in his mind it promotes a more masculine view than Christianity. That's one of the specific points he's made, is how Christianity is a weak religion and it's for weak people, and Islam is about strength and some of these things. So I think there's definitely not all one monolith kind of. It's kind of multifaceted, and I think that's where we could do a disservice when we put a lot of them in the same category, because some of the things that the manosphere would be promoting, like men being promiscuous, is not something that Doug Wilson would explicitly promote. Now, he would probably still, hold like a female virginity higher than male virginity or something like that. There'd still be some of those things where you could definitely read between the lines, I think, but it's not as upfront as some of the manospheres on that front.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't it Doug Wilson that talked about likened the locks and keys analogy or something, which in a way is sort of excusing male masculinity, like saying, oh, male promiscuity isn't as big a deal, and that's implied. I don't think he would say that either. But yeah, I would definitely agree that the appeal of figures anywhere from Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Doug Wilson, sort of is an indication that, and this is probably more prevalent in the evangelical church, perhaps, but I certainly come across it in Anabaptist circles as well, where it seems like the church doesn't have a good vision of, where men can have purpose and belonging and stuff. So I think there's room for the church to grow in that. I think sometimes they perceive the non-resistant view as being passive, and I think in our culture we can sometimes say, oh, you just get a job and have a wife and kids and all that, which can be a great thing, but sometimes for youth, they have the energy and the drive and stuff, and there are more things that they could be doing for the world, and I think we often fail to give them a positive vision of what manhood should and could be. I think Zachary Wagner does an excellent job critiquing where we've fallen short. The other book I recently read, and I think you guys have as well, is The Men We Need from Brant Hansen. He's also not an Anabaptist, but he had some really good points about male masculinity, where our power and strength are served to protect those around us. We Anabaptists might, recoil a little bit, about this protection being the driving force for masculinity or whatever. But the way he presents it, I think, is very well done, that people should feel safer when we're around, and, we should look out for others, keep others' best interests in mind. And that's part of what a positive vision of masculinity looks like.
Yeah, I like the point that Hansen makes, that responsibility and initiative, investment should be the center of masculinity. And as I'm thinking that, of course, responsibility is a women's thing too. Women are often very much taking on responsibilities, but there's sort of that thing that Brent talks about, which is about passivity and just not being invested, not caring. And that happens like in the dating world, relationships too. Like usually the stereotype is like guys are the ones who lack the investment and the commitment. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But since you brought up Anabaptism, maybe you guys could talk a little bit about like what does masculinity look like for an Anabaptist who believes in nonviolence, who believes in the separation of kingdoms. Because just to give some background, a lot of what's being promoted as masculinity out there is very much like empire building, militarism, like John Wayne or Rambo, just like that whole militaristic ideal of manhood or like political power, being the big powerful statesman leader. Anabaptists are probably or shouldn't be looking for political or military power. So what does manhood or masculinity look like for an Anabaptist?
Yeah, I just have to think right now of like the current controversy is a country song, which by Jason Aldean about don't what is it called? Don't try that in a small town or something like that. It's talking about how like crime and some of the things that they see happening in more urban areas, theft on the rise and things like why if you try that in a small town, it's not going to go well for you. And there's definitely some racial overtones or implications you can draw from that. But I think even more just the part about vigilante justice that the song is kind of glorifying. Like I think that's something that as in the Anabaptist world, you're not going to find as much. And I think that's something that's unique about between, I would say, Anabaptists and like evangelical is for the most part. I mean, I grew up in one of the most prominent stories, like young Mennonite Anabaptist people grow up with, is the story of Dirk Willems and how he turned around. This was an Anabaptist in the 16th century, I think, or 16th or 17th century, one of those. He was, being chased by his pursuers after he had broken out of prison, where he was in prison for his faith, and he ran across some ice, and he was able to get across, but his pursuer was not, and fell through, and he turned back and helped his pursuer to safety, and then was promptly arrested and burned at the stake a couple days later. And so that was a story that we grew up with. That was something that we grew up as looking at, I would say, as a model for what a man does. And I mean, I think we can all point to examples in the Mennonite world where that ideal was not lived up to. But I think there is a difference there. And that was the story, that was one of the main kind of narratives that we grew up with. And I think another one is a narrative of there's a story, I forget the actual name, maybe Ray remembers, of the book, but that has that story in it. But it's about the guy that was an Anabaptist, and it was during a time when it wasn't a death sentence, but it did mean kind of acts of persecution from other Protestant and Catholic groups in the area. And there were some men who came and were taking the thatch off his roof as a means of kind of disrupting his life and damaging his property. And they heard, like him and his wife heard the men taking all the thatch off his roof and damaging his property. And then he told his wife to make a dinner and to set out some food. And he went out and told the men, he said, well, you've just been working really hard. Why don't you come inside and we have some food prepared for you? And so they came inside and they fed them. And then after the men left, him and his wife, a little bit later, heard them putting the thatch back on the roof. And their kindness had won out and had made these men feel guilty for what they had done and how they had treated this man and his wife for being Anabaptist. And I think that was another story that, I heard growing up multiple times, read it. And so there was a sense, I think, that vigilante justice was something that the world does, but it wasn't something we did. But I think that doesn't mean that there isn't a crisis of masculinity in Anabaptism as well. I think reading this book by Brant Hansen, where he talks about toxic passivity, and toxic passivity was not in his mind somebody who, doesn't enact, somebody who's non-resistant or somebody who doesn't use violence or force. But toxic passivity can also be somebody who doesn't stand up for the vulnerable around them. And so I think in Mennonite circles, when it comes to abuse or domestic violence or sexual abuse or any kind of abuse, physical abuse, there's been a lot of examples of men who just kind of looked the other way when those things happen, or actively tried to cover it up. And I think that would be an example of this toxic passivity. They weren't standing up for the vulnerable around them. And just by, again, standing up for the vulnerable does not mean exacting vigilante justice. It means saying something. It means stepping in the face of evil. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean using force, but it can just mean, no, this is not, we're not going to create a system that allows this to go on. So I think that's one example of where, just because we as Anabaptists can kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we don't fall into the trap of vigilante justice that maybe even larger evangelicalism promotes through the media they consume and through the heroes that they kind of look up to. We don't have that same, and some of it definitely is creeping into our circles, for sure. We're being influenced a lot by that, but I think there's also other ways that toxic passivity has affected our churches.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Abram had to share there, as far as like positive visions of Anabaptist masculinity. Of course, we would point to Jesus as sort of the ideal masculine person, and really an ideal for any human, for that matter. Zachary Wagner, and in his book, points out that neither Christian fatherhood nor masculinity are about fitting cultural masculine stereotypes. Jesus rejected many stereotypes of his own day. Fatherhood and maleness can look 1,000 different ways, even ways that appear stereotypically feminine. A point I tried to illustrate in the list above. He said, and he uses examples of masculine men who can do, in all manner of thing, helping prepare a meal for the homeless, or all manner of things where you're working for the good in the world. I think that's sort of a vision for masculinity. Now, that doesn't mean that that we're against, we have to be against men lifting weights or something. If somebody gets a joy out of that, there is nothing wrong with that. Of course, like many other hobbies, it can become an idol, but it's both having a vision for those type of guys, and as Brant Hansen would say it, avid endorsement, which I tend to be a little more on that end of the spectrum. So there's, we shouldn't be defining our masculinity by that. We shouldn't be judging people based on, their natural, hobbies and interests in that way, whether they are stereotypically masculine or not. But yeah, avoiding a passive, I don't care type of thing. In the example, the story, I also grew up with that story, Abram, and I don't know where it was based, but it is a good example of thinking outside of the box. In my temptation here in America would be, somebody's destroying my property, I call the police and let them handle it. Now, I don't think it's wrong for non-resistant people to call the police in some situation. Romans 13 says, that the government God is in control of the government, and they serve to, I consider them taking care of the sins of the unbelievers by their own standards. But just that doesn't mean that calling the police is always the best option. And that's sort of a passive option in the case for Abram, where a masculine is inviting them in for a meal. Like, that took courage, and that examples like that, I feel, are good examples of how we can go beyond. Also recall reading, I think it was a Mennonite university, where they had a problem with, a bit of a homeless man that is sort of scaring some of the students, and the leadership just told them to call the police and stay inside, whatever. But I think it was some of the students that got together and decided, hey, we're going to create this like message group. If anybody sees this guy, and feel threatened, they should text those guys. And then this group of men, or I think it was primarily students they're going to respond and talk to the guy. Like, the guy wasn't violent necessarily, just a homeless guy with mental illness of some sort. And I think being creative in ways like that, using taking initiative and trying to accomplish the good without just relying on other ways to distance the problem from ourselves, which I find is a real temptation for myself.
Brant Hansen talks about conflict avoidance as being a part of passivity, that just like avoiding the problem or trying to get somebody else to solve it is not a good Christian thing to do sometimes.
Yeah, I think one of the chapters that Brant Hansen has is he kind of lays out like 6 or 7 kind of decisions that men, young men specifically, but men can make to, I don't know, he would necessarily say to be more masculine, but it's a decision that you can make to kind of be. I should go back and say Brant Hansen's first chapter in the book is about men's call to be keepers of the garden, and that was Adam's call when God appointed him in the Garden of Eden to be the keeper of the garden. And that does, I mean, there's he says it's not that the women's role was different, it was just as equally as important, but Adam's specific call as being tender or keeper of the garden. And so he kind of lays out these different ways that men can be keepers of the garden. And one of them, he says, make women and children feel safe, not threatened. And he doesn't necessarily just, I mean, we sometimes think of like, oh yeah, sure, we're going to protect our, the vulnerable around us, by doing, you talk to maybe your average evangelical, or I wouldn't say evangelical, but just, the redneck idea that is like, oh, I'm going to carry a gun. I'm going to always be, prepared to defend myself using physical force or bodily force, or physical force or weaponry to defend those helpless around me. But he goes into that a lot more of like, no, this is something as simple as sometimes protecting them from ourselves. And I think he talks about, men not, using women for their own consumption, but to be, as not treating them as an object, some of that. But I think he also says, I'm trying to look for the quote here, but he talks about Jesus, an example of the woman the woman caught in adultery, and he just talks. His quote here is, once again, Jesus is giving us a brilliant picture of masculinity done right. Where Adam had failed, he let a woman face an enemy without saying a word. Jesus rises to this woman's defense and sends her enemy scurrying away. Think about this. Our culture specializes in uncovering shame, particularly that of women, explicitly and for the disordered delight of others. Uncovering shame diminishes, exposes, and dehumanizes. And so he's talking about how Jesus did the opposite for that woman. Like he protected her. He stood up for her, for those who wanted to expose her shame and wanted to, treat her not, wanted to mistreat her. And so I think that's, there's, and then he also has one where he talks about the swords we have in our mouths, like even the words we speak, protecting, making women and children feel safe, not threatened, is also our own actions, and make sure our actions aren't hurting those around us. And I really like how he uses some of the same kind of phrases that you would hear from maybe a more right-wing Christian or non-Christian influencer, but he turns it on its head. And so when he says men should take responsibility. Well, that's something that, Andrew Tate says too. But then, his warped and twisted version of what it means to take responsibility is not Christian. It's usually anything but that. And I think Chris Hansen, or this Brant Hansen, does a really good job of kind of turning that on its head a little bit and saying, yeah, men should take responsibility. Here's what that's going to look like. And I think any man that reads this book is going to be convicted in multiple areas and of ways that they're not living up to. I think they're not living up to being that keeper of the garden. And I think this book is really important. I think both of these are really important. I think Zachary Wagner does a really good job of critiquing a lot of the messages that evangelical Christianity has kind of sent in the past. And I think Mennonites, and a lot of times we borrow a lot of those things, especially popular culture from evangelicalism. We borrow a lot of that. And are influenced by that as well. So it's relevant to us as well, these critiques.
The keeper of the garden concept is really cool because before there was Eve, before there was like literally anything else, even work, even whatever it is that people use to define masculinity today, because masculinity is often defined in relation to either sex or women or careers or whatever it is. But Adam's call to be the keeper of the garden precedes all of that. And it also ties in really well to, I think, what Jesus teaches about like the good shepherd who leads the sheep to still waters, or who, the bad hired shepherds are the ones who sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees and just avoids the conflict. The good shepherd is the one who lays down his life for the sheep. And there is I think a positive concept of protection in Jesus's example in John chapter 10, that like I do a lot of studies in toxic benevolence, that this kind of like very Caesar-like way of like looking at your underlings. They're actually serving you, they're making you rich, they're expanding your empire, but you see it as, oh, I am their benevolent father. Basically, that's the Roman concept. Like literally they would see their slaves in this way, like I am here to care for them, and it's all about me being good and benevolent. I think Jesus offers a really different and a really much more positive and healthy definition of protection that doesn't fall into sort of like the whole patriarchal slave-based or damsel in distress narrative that society tends to idealize almost. So that's really good. And I think we're just like starting to discover what a kingdom kind of masculinity is. And there's an interesting connection, I think, between Christian nationalism and this toxic, violent, empire-like type of masculinity. I think Jesus and John Wayne is a good book about that. And as well as we can see some of the most odd and crazy, like far out there Christian so-called masculine ideals, they come together recently, and these people, these influencers, created this conference called Christendom 2.0, how like 7 principles for ruling the world. And so like basically we know what that's about. They're version of masculinity is basically to reenact colonialism and Christian empire. So obviously we're not about that in the kingdom of God. Maybe we can talk a little bit about Zachary Wagner's book and what does he mean by a healthy male sexuality, and what does it mean for us to sort of reconfigure masculinity and male sexuality in a world that is driven by like pornography and by conquest. Sexual conquest is defining what it means to be a man.
I don't have all my notes in front of me for what Zachary Wagner. I think some of it comes up in his critiques of things like Every Man's Battle. And I just remember, especially for myself, when I read Every Man's Battle, it was probably 7-8 years ago at this point. It was during a time when I was going through a spiritual and moral crisis in my life. I was addicted to pornography. And honestly, that book just did not help me at all. And part of it was because I couldn't relate to the experiences they shared in the book. I actually read the one that's called Every Young Man's Battle. It's kind of a similar version, but tweaked for more like young men. But so much of the book, because of somebody like myself who's same-sex attracted and was, my object of lust was not women. And so a lot of the things that they talked about, such as, you need to preserve your eyes for your future spouse. Well, that some of those things just I couldn't relate to it because that was not like I could be married to a woman and that would not the idea that I need to like somehow corral this lust I feel and then until I can express it in marriage is not something that is it's not something that resonated with me because it was not something that would fix my situation. And so I think there was just so much I couldn't relate to the book. And I think that's where his critiques of that, I think, are spot on in that he looks at a lot of that and says this idea that men, like if we tell young men that they're going to be, their lust is going to be practically uncontrollable, and then that happens, like, is that kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way? And I think that's where, if we're, and especially if we're telling young men, okay, so you find yourself in a place where lust is taking control of your life and it's overwhelming and it's becoming, it's got you kind of, like, I think one of the things that isn't looked at enough is how much of that is just driven by loneliness. And I think if we can find ways for young men that are addicted to find connection and to connection with other men, not just, connection with the opposite sex, that's going to be important as well, but connection with other men, so much of it is driven by loneliness. So sometimes it's going to not mean, it's going to be kind of these other ways of addressing this. Sometimes, like for myself, it's been because I'm not physically active enough for other, so there's different things, like there's different ways we can look at that and help in kind of that journey of learning to control our lust and learning to deal with that I think a lot of ways the books that were put out 15-20 years ago in the 90s and early 2000s just weren't, they didn't have, I think there's so much more better resources now, and that's why I'm really thankful for this book, because I think he covers that really well.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points there, and especially with your story, Zachary has a great section on that, where he has a chapter sort of about what he calls the great sex prosperity gospel. Basically, like if you wait until you're married, everything will be great with you and your wife and all that, which is not a biblical promise by any means, and yet many people internalize that sexuality is a burden for them that they must bear until they can get married, which is not a great, not really a great way to view it through the teen years and stuff like that, and particularly for somebody with Abram's experience and stuff like that. He has a note here about how he feels evangelical notion of that it is a hard thing, but it'll be better when you get married, might have actually contributed to pushes for rights to gay marriage, because the ideal is to get married, and anything less means you're just not, you're not quite as good as everybody else. Now, of course, they don't say that, and even in our conservative Mennonite communities, no one would up and say that, but actions tend to speak louder than words. And the fact that we have there's no space for singles. I shouldn't say no space. I think there's a lot of things that are getting better in many churches now, but that can be a bigger problem, that we sort of view singleness as a temporary thing. And of course, for many people it is, but for other people, it can be a lifelong thing. And if we just say, oh, grin and bear it type of thing, that's not a great vision for how things ought to be. And as Abram said, it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, like, oh, you will struggle with this, then you sort of give up when you do in fact struggle with those things. And or if you don't have the exact experience like everyone else, you're not supposed to talk about it and stuff like that. That I think is where people might turn inward and contributes to loneliness. The Trevor Noah actually had a clip that I found really fascinating, coming from like a mainstream celebrity, about how there's some I don't know, probably sort of coming out of the the involuntary celibate community online, which is sort of a radical group, but the right to sex or something like that. And he said he feels that comes from the fact that extreme loneliness, the fact that they feel they can't share their feelings or can't share, the connection, being actually good friends with somebody, something that's almost become that, that people go to sex for that. And more so than looking like, oh, look at those awful men that just want to have sex, we should perhaps be looking like, why, what are we doing? What culture are we creating where men feel like that is their only way to fulfill their desire for relationship and closeness and other things like that? It's yeah, and the church, I think, but should start by giving a message of what meaningful singleness can look like, and that we shouldn't just have to grin and bear it, but actually teach, sort of the theology of what sexuality is for. Zachary Wagner has a quote that about the desire for sex is a desire for a good thing, like that was part of God's creation. At worst, it could be a misdirection of what God intended, but we just viewing it as bad until you're married is something that a lot of people tend to struggle with. And he gives examples of how male sexuality was actually intended to be a life-giving thing, of course, but also a self-giving thing, a thing of sharing and stuff. And setting that vision, if you say, oh, just grin and bear it till you're married, and then you can have all the sex you want, is sort of the implied thing. Sort of like minimizes the women's choice in this, which has led to many issues in marriages. And as a single person, I don't really feel qualified. I don't want to be one of those cringe people with all the marriage advice. But there is certainly true that what you internalize those messages and stuff will, if you don't have a better vision of what sexuality is for and things like that, it will affect the way that you view a relationship and so on. And one of the positives that Zachary gives would be that, male sexuality is for fatherhood, he gives all sorts of examples, anything from, coaching a kid's sports team to, helping out at your church to, Sunday school type of thing, or your own biological kids, which is what most people think of as fatherhood. And yeah, he says, yeah, that is among the other things, where, if we have a desire for a family, or we can not just, be sad that it isn't happening yet, but also think like, okay, what can I do? How can I be a father or help, other people? You know, there is an epidemic of loneliness. I mean, the Mennonite church has, to some extent, done better at creating close community than perhaps mainstream culture, where they don't have any religious services at all, or evangelical megachurches where you don't even really know the people who go to church. So I think Mennonites do have something to offer in that regard, but again, the expectation of marriage and stuff is a sentiment that is still found in many Mennonite circles as well. And for those of us, like us three, that are still single, it can lead to points of difficulty where, um, yeah, where people sometimes give the impression that, just deal with it. That's the way it is for singles, instead of, yeah, giving a vision of what does a meaningful life look like, being 40 and single and serving the Lord, or being 60 and single and serving the Lord, instead of saying, oh, that's just this and that bachelor, and he's a little weird and whatever. And it's like, yeah, maybe he's not great at social things because you've never invited him, and he doesn't know, what it's like to be invited to, help coach kids or something like that. There's um so I would feel like that's one place where the church can help create that, manliness does not mean having, the perfect family with 5 kids or whatever. That is a great thing. That's part of God's vision for creation, but it doesn't mean that it's for everyone. And the messaging in the church, I think, should reflect accordingly.
I really like some of the points you guys brought out. That was really good. I mean, I wrote an article about how one of the things that pornography and sort of this consumerist culture creates is this relational brokenness. So the gospel of peace really is about bringing people into relational wholeness and relational holiness, which means community, which means connection. And like pornography is like an itch, you keep scratching it, the worse it gets, and then it becomes this whole wound. And the more, if there's loneliness and yet you fall into a culture of pornography, it's not just the action itself, it's the wider culture and that entitlement. The more you do that, the more alienated you become. And so that's almost what the incel community is doing. The more they dig into that, the more women feel afraid around them, that women don't feel safe, that women feel a lot of anger and resentment. But that's what, the more you pursue this, the worse it's gonna get. And the underlying problem, the need, is not there. The relationship and the connection isn't there. And I think another thing that one of my professors in sociology was saying is that toxic masculinity or patriarchy in society creates competitiveness between men, that men feel like they have to prove their masculinity to one another, and sort of some level of competition is good. But when it becomes having to compete with one another, there's always this feeling that you're not good enough. I think almost everybody that has this feeling that you're not good enough. You're just not as manly as the other guy. You're not as feminine as the other woman. There's this sense that only the winners win and everybody else is second, third, fourth, fifth place. Does that make sense? And then the other thing that seems to be the issue, and I don't know if you guys want to chime in or just share experiences about this. I'm curious what dominant cultural masculinity does to the issue of like emotional health for men, the ability to express emotions or express vulnerability, to have that openness and connection. Because maybe you have friends, but maybe you feel like you may be going through like a crisis or emotional health issues, but you can't actually voice it out. You don't have that kind of like deep connection or um ability to, so there can be loneliness while still having friends because you don't have an emotional connection. Like I think there's a lot of, yeah, so do you guys have any thoughts about emotional health for men?
Yeah, just to go back to what you said about kind of men creating this competition, a really good book I read a number of years ago that really addresses just that topic head on is called Man Enough by Nate Pyle. And it's basically a book about kind of this idea that, you know, this is what it creates to be a man, and you kind of lead into these certain stereotypes of being like um, you know, a lumberjack or being kind of this muscular dude and doing all these outdoorsy things. And you know, some of that's reinforced by Christian men's conferences. I mean, we saw one recently that was like the most extreme you could find, where they had like a tank and, you know, some Rambo dude, you know, riding in the stage on a tank and some crazy stunts like that, which is like a very extreme version, but it's still one of those things where, you know, it's kind of like you just, yeah, you just wonder, like, or they're having like cage fights as part of their, you know, like, I don't need to hear the gospel from a wrestler. I'm sorry. I just, like, I'm not that type of man at all. And so it's not going to be relevant to me. But I think at the same time, I can kind of poke fun at that, and I can kind of, you know, scoff at that. And I think what I want to say is that, again, that is kind of getting into, again, this competition. Like, it's like, oh, I don't have to do those things to be a man, but that doesn't make me any less of a man than the man who does enjoy those things. While I think that man has to acknowledge that, you know what, because Abram doesn't enjoy those things, doesn't make him any less of a man. And I think we can, like, I think we, a guy like that and a guy like me can still encourage each other. Like, we can still, I think there's still things. Now, we might not have as many things in common. You know, I'll go on an hour long or half an hour rant about like the latest book I read and how great, you know, this period of literature is, or whatever. And it's going to go completely over his head, and he's going to be completely bored by it. While I'm going to be just as bored when he starts talking about his pickup truck and what engine his pickup truck has, and how he, you know, how he fixed his engine on his pickup truck. That I have nothing, you know. Yeah, that's as boring as can be to me. Or what, you know, if he's trying to explain a particular sport to me, that's going to be boring as well. But I think at the same time, like, there's still ways, you know, we can find connection, and there doesn't need to be me scoffing at him and saying, oh, like, you know, you need to do all these things to feel like a man, how immature of you. And I think, you know, at the same time, he doesn't need to be scoffing at me and go like, what kind of sissy man are you? Like, I think that's very unhealthy. And I think that's where I want to, while my impulse is to scoff and say, you know, if that's what you think it takes to be a man or whatever, like, that's just, you know, why do you enjoy those things? That those things in itself usually aren't toxic. It can definitely lead to that, but I think we need to avoid that kind of pitting one type of man against another or something like that, kind of that comparison. But just be there for each other and recognize that diversity in the kingdom is going to mean that some guys are going to be the mechanics and the um, you know, the ones that are more hands-on labor, and then the computer coder or the writer is also part of the kingdom and can contribute. And I think you know, the intellectual and the farmer, that they don't have to be opposed to each other. Like, they can both be part of the kingdom and really add value to the kingdom. And I think that's going to be part of that diversity, and that we can recognize that and create a space for all of them to contribute to the kingdom and feel valued, is and a sense of purpose. I think that's where it comes back to, like these basic ideas of being keeper of the garden is so important. And actually, the vision of what it means to be a kingdom follower of Christ, that doesn't have to be boiled down to, here's what it means to be a masculine or a man follower of Christ or a woman. Like even those things, we can still, like, if we go back to those kind of basic values and what the purpose is for, why, why are we Christ followers? Why do we want to promote his kingdom? Like I think those things, if we can come back to those things and remind ourselves, it's going to help alleviate some of this kind of opposition. But now I forget what I wanted to kind of hit on that. What was the last part of your question?
Oh, about like emotional health.
Yes. If Ray has something to say on that, I'll let him go ahead. I want to pull up a quote here about that.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead a bit about the not pitting against one type of masculine against the other. Like the reality is we live in a society that is highly interdependent on each other. And it's, I think, a vision of manhood where we work together in ways that contribute to that society functioning better together. Being a protector of the garden doesn't mean that you mine your own metal and have your own forge and make your own guns so that you can protect. Like nobody is saying that. So like realistically, we need to work together, and that I think is part of it. I am super thankful for the farmers out there because everyone had the farming skills I did. We'd probably be a lot more hungry than we are right now. And so like it's very important for us to recognize also like disentangling what toxic masculinity is versus stereotypically masculine behavior and stuff like that. I think that's super important that we're very clear, we don't have anything against, farmers or truck mechanics or big muscular dudes who like to lift weights or, any manner of things where we don't fit in. Some of us might not. And I think it's very important to recognize toxic masculinity is things that harm other people, that are a sign of brokenness, a sign of sin that has entered the world through the fall. And what do we call brokenness? We call it sin. So there's like the truly toxic parts of masculinity are just examples of sin. Of course, they're not the only sins and not the worst sins necessarily. So we also need to avoid a preoccupation in that regard. But it is important to recognize what we are calling toxic masculinity is, saying mean things because you want to appear tough and stuff like that. And that's not an example of, Christ's, vision of interaction or human flourishing and that type of thing. Things we do, that toxic masculinity, things we do because we want to project a certain image, even when it goes against human flourishing. And it does not mean, trucks or weights or all the other things that sometimes people bundle in with as part of toxic masculinity in popular culture. And I find that is more harmful than it's helpful. But yeah, that and I think that goes both ways. Yeah, like Abram said, we shouldn't be judgmental. I might like sort of roll my eyes at people, if I might bring up, how I find the Anabaptist attempts at coming up with a theodicy, explaining the reason why God allows evil, and people's eyes just glaze over sometimes. And, I'm tempted to judge them, and they're probably tempted to judge me for having doubts and stuff like that. So I think important part of masculinity is being able to recognize that people are different and being able to be a protector and a helper for everyone, whether it's men, women, or kids, that they would, help human flourishing, be a protector, be somebody safe, whether it comes to physical things or more, and being friends, being something that people can be close to and people can share with. And yeah, Abram probably has his quote up by now, and I'm sure he has more to say on the topic of guys and sharing their feelings and all that.
I thought that I just wanted to comment on the point that you made about how like the toxic masculinity part is often about sin. Like I remember reading the study about workplace sexual harassment and how there's this sort of bro culture in some places where harassing a woman or making locker room jokes kind of makes you more of a man. And so people who don't even want to participate kind of feel pressured too. And so that's the kind of thing like misogyny, sexism, objectifying, and even like the celebration of like adultery and promiscuity or even abuse. Like those are the things that we're talking about with that are harmful. And then the other thing that you mentioned was I'm just thinking of Abram's actually in a fire station right now.
Yeah, I one of my roles as you could say a keeper of the garden, but one of my hobbies is to be a volunteer fireman. I work in construction as my day job, and then most of my other time is used being the assistant chief here at the fire department. And so I think that's another example of where uh, protecting the vulnerable, and especially when we consider like a nonviolent way. That's one way that I can do that is by helping rescue lives, serving in the medical side of it, and the first responder role can really I can really make a big impact in people's lives by utilizing the skills that I have to benefit their lives in a positive way. And that's one way that I can do that through this. Yeah. So, but yeah, when it comes to men's like emotional health, I just back to what Ray was saying about, I think one of the examples I've seen lately, and I didn't read the article, was conservatives were going off about some, probably a New York Times article. I don't know exactly where it was, but where it was talking about like the origins, the white supremacist origins of fitness, of men's fitness in the U.S. And I'm like, okay, that there's actually some very like valid historical context there. I didn't read the article, but I could just kind of guess that, yeah, they went into the eugenics movement of the early 1920s or 1900s, where there was this big emphasis on, we should only be allowing the most, the most muscular, the most kind of vibrant of our species to reproduce, and we should be trying to find ways to limit reproduction of what the lesser people in society. And unfortunately, some of that included, the lesser people included Black people or non-white people. And so, yeah, there's, this idea of kind of gyms and some of the, really when some of those things started, wrestling and sports. One of my favorite movies is the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson being the first man to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. If I ever want to cry, I just watch that movie because it makes me cry every time. And it's a very powerful movie. I think anybody should watch it. And I think also it's a really good example of masculinity. I think his restraint and the strength that he showed in that is a very good example of what positive masculinity looks like. But anyway, I think again, so this article that conservatives were going off about, like, oh, so they're saying, if you lift weights, it's being white supremacist. Well, maybe they were. I don't know. I didn't read the article. I can see why they're reacting to the headline. I'm sure that there was some, a lot of the right-wing influencers are talking about like men being muscular and strong and lifting weights and some of that. And honestly, I'm like, I think health, as someone who is not healthy, I am, I'll just say it, I am overweight. And it's something that I don't like about myself. It's something I want to change. It's something that has been a source of shame in my life. And at the same time, that shame hasn't helped me get any better. And so I think we don't need to be shaming men who aren't muscular, who aren't at the health that they desire or the health that maybe they should be. So I think we need to avoid doing that. I think at the same time, we can help encourage men to be more healthy, because physical health is, I think there's more and more studies that show how much physical health correlates with mental health and with spiritual health even. And so I think that is an important part. And for myself, as I work, like I've been going to therapy for most of this year, and it's been very helpful. And one of the things we and my therapist talk about quite a bit is my physical health. And it's not just about like me trying to work out more or anything like that. Even just simple as like getting more sleep and how that interacts with my mental health and my spiritual health. And so I think that's, it's been interesting to kind of see the connection of those things and work through that in a setting with a therapist. And so if there's any guy listening that's like, I'm not sure about going to therapy, I would say, hey, I was there. I was there, a couple months ago, and I did not know what to do. I finally, I was just like, I'm kind of at my wit's end, and I'll try this. And it's been really good for me, and I would highly recommend it. And yeah, you might find a therapist that's not good. Well, you know what, just try another one. So I think they're out there. There's different ways you can do it. I like mine that's in person. I go in and sit in his office. You can do it online if that's not, if you'd rather do that. There's different ways you can do that, and it's not that expensive. I'd say it definitely pays off in the end. And so, but I think that's another thing of like, sometimes when I'm sitting there talking to my therapist about certain things, like it's really good. He has the expertise and the knowledge, and he has the training. He went to college for this for a number of years, and he has a master's degree in counseling and mental health. And so, I mean, he definitely has tools and expertise that other people don't have. But some of the things we talk about, I kind of sit there and think like, wow, these are things that I could probably just work out with close friends. And so I think we need, and that's some of the things we've been talking about is how can I, practical ways for me to develop stronger relationships and with men and women in my life, other people in my life, so I'm not as lonely, and like practical ways to kind of deal with the loneliness and the isolation. And I think one of those things, like I just thought about, was shame. And whether it's shame, like I talked about with my physical health, or whether it's shame because of my sexuality, it's shame around like addiction, sexual addiction, any of those things, is a lot of times because we feel a lot of shame, we also feel like we have a very self-deprecating view of ourselves, a very self-hate, you could almost say self-hatred. It's a strong word, but a lot of guys feel like, I think deep down, they really hate themselves and who they are. And but they don't know any way they don't feel worthy of relationships. They don't feel worthy of trying to reach out to people. And I think that's something we need to really recognize, and we need to help those men specifically. But I mean, anybody, but women feel that too. I think men and women deal with that shame and that self-loathing in different ways. Some, women, I think, more tend towards self-harm, physical self-harm. But I think men, I mean, we self-harm too. It might not be as much physical self-harm, but I think there's other ways we try to kind of punish ourselves if we feel like. And I think, having somebody that we can talk that through with when we are feeling that shame, feeling safe. And the quote I wanted to find was a Tim Keller quote he said, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. To be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. And that's something that I really appreciate about my pastor, is so many of his sermons, so many of kind of his emphasis in just the way he talks to me personally or to others personally, but also in a lot of the sermons and kind of what he wants to promote is just to really get people to recognize how much they are loved by God. And I think so many times, because we're feeling this self-loathing, we project that onto other people. We think that other people hate us as much as we hate ourselves, or that God dislikes us as much as we dislike ourselves. And so I think that's that's a very toxic place to be if we're projecting that now on other people. And I'm saying this because that's exactly the things that I've had to work through with my therapist. And he goes, you really, like, we had to dig into, okay, I feel really unworthy. I hate, like, I basically, you could say hate, it's a strong word, but that's where I was. And in some ways still am sometimes. Uh, Hate myself, and then I project that onto other people and think, well, other people don't want to be around me either, and God feels the same way about me as I do about myself, and so then that leads to like isolation, and so and of course isolation is, I would say, a more extreme form. Like loneliness can be something that we feel when we are around other people, we can feel that, but I think so isolation and loneliness are distinct but go hand in hand. And I think that's just a point I wanted to bring up, was kind of this idea of being known and being loved is a core human need. It's not just for men, it's not just for women, but I think men especially have a very unhealthy way of dealing with that. And because of cultural expectations and some of those gender stereotypes, we try not to recognize, like we don't want to admit that as much. I think women are more freely to admit when they feel isolated or when they feel shame. They're maybe more open to talk about some of that than men are.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying there, Abram. Even in my personal experience, I think I've internalized that a lot. That um, I will say I have like great friends at church and stuff like that. And we even have, conversations about feelings and stuff like that. But it tends to be, when we're more in a group setting with guys and girls, where it's more acceptable to talk about these things. And yeah, I have a couple great guy friends at church also, but and nonetheless, I like feel like I censor myself a little bit what I say because of how I might be perceived if I shared what I'm struggling with right at the moment or something like that. Um, and and yet me not sharing is sort of contributing to the issue of people not being open because um, it just sort of because I'm not talking about it, other people don't feel safe in sharing, what they're dealing with and that type of thing. It can sort of, it's sort of how culture works, where, what everyone does sort of affects each other. Um, and one thing I wanted to sort of point out about mental health, like if you're, mentally healthy and don't need to go to a counselor, like that's totally fine. But, um, I personally haven't gone to counseling. I'm probably could get some good out of it, but like I don't feel like that's a strong need for me right now. But that's nothing to brag about. And if I sit here all smug that I don't have to go to counseling, don't help anybody out, what good is it to me that I don't go to counseling if I'm not being a useful man in God's kingdom? So I feel like, there's it's a very important that we don't judge other people. Like, yeah, we might not be dealing with the same issues, but that's not the important part. The important part is that we do work towards doing what we know to be good, and um, that's more important example of masculinity. Uh, so yeah, I think there's definitely um, I mean, and then there's sometimes some guys just don't feel the need to share. I don't think people should be pressured to share every detail. That's also not, just going from one extreme to the other, saying, oh, oh, girls do this or that. It doesn't mean men have to do it, but it also, I mean, if it shouldn't be looked at down upon. Like maybe we could, in fact, learn a bit and relate better if we did. Uh, if we shared or were open in ways that we aren't right now. And it can be hard to be a leader in that type of thing, but I think that could be a manly thing. Doing the hard things isn't always splitting wood. It can also be leading conversations that aren't easy to talk about, and that type of stuff as well.
That thing about the stereotypes, a lot of it, I mean, so much comes from the Romans, but Stoicism is one thing that came from the Romans. Sort of the idea that you're just meh, like you don't have extreme emotions, or you don't show any kind of vulnerability, you're always projecting strength. That is something left over in the culture from the Romans, and we don't need to hold on to that anymore. But the other thing that came to mind is a lot of this crisis of masculinity uh, is not helped by shame coming from like progressives, because I think realizing, like listening to this conversation, one of the things that progressives tend to do is try to correct what's wrong in society with shame. So like, for example, with racism, then it's supposedly the correction to that is supposedly just white people feeling a lot of guilt and shame, and then the correction to like abuse is like putting this shame on men for just like being, oh, you're a guy, so you're guilty in some way, or you should feel ashamed of your masculinity. um i I don't think that's helpful. I think that in Christian circles, we have to have something that builds people up rather than tears them down or tries to use shame as a coercive or manipulative force. um yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
Well, and that, I think, talking about kind of stoicism or, yeah, stereotypes around like men's expressing emotion. Like, I think that's one thing I like about Brant Hansen was he really talks about, like, he also wrote a whole book about anger. But one of the things he talks about is like, if you think somehow, like, there's even this portrayal at times where like anger is somehow a masculine trait, or it's something that's manly. And he's like, no, that's what toddlers do. Like, you want to talk about like immaturity and non, like, it's anger is, I've heard it say like anger is one of the few emotions that men feel comfortable expressing. And I think that's, yeah, that's really harmful and detrimental. It's, that's not being a keeper of the garden. That's not making women and children feel safe around you. And even, this idea of there's righteous anger, I've, that's, he's like, no, that's not, like, righteous anger is not a thing. He said more like, you can say determination, like you can say, he said people that are angry aren't thinking rationally. They're not controlling themselves. And so it means like you could be very motivated, you could be very passionate about something, but once that crosses over into like anger and you want to try to justify it by saying that that's righteous anger, like, no, once you're angry, you're not thinking rationally anymore. And you're just, again, you're acting out of your kind of blind emotion. But I think that's one trait where men, but again, what I want to reiterate about kind of this talking about men and emotions, like, one of the things we need to do is recognize that for each person that's different, and each man that's different, and that's something that, like, typologies can be can have their detriments, but that's one thing I like about the Enneagram. And the more I study the Enneagram, me being an Enneagram 4, somebody who really feels very deeply, cries at a lot of movies at the drop of a hat, like just all of these traits that, go along with, kind of the typology of Enneagram 4 is very different than, um, you know, in a lot of ways, it's different than, like Ray, who's an Enneagram 5. Like, it's always kind of interesting to see, like, when me and him have a conversation and to kind of see things that I find like meaningful or emotional, or that, made me cry. He sees different things than I do. He just interacts with those things in a different way. And it's interesting to see that, and to kind of observe that. And I think that's where, for each man that you're dealing with, each young man, like, there might be some men who you have to say like, hey, you're too emotional, you need to learn to, get yourself together and control yourself. But I would say that's probably a minority of men that you need to say that to. um, Other men, it might be, hey, you're angry a lot, that's not healthy. Let's figure out how we can help you deal with that anger. um, you know I think each man, and each, is, if you're a mentor to young men or whatever, like, whatever advice you give to one young man might not be the same you give to another. And some of that's going to depend on their personality. And I think that's where the Enneagram is a helpful tool in kind of assessing, like, okay, if this person's an Enneagram 4, this is how we can make, this is the things we can do to make him feel loved. and make him feel known. And that might be different for somebody that's a 5 or a 7 or any of the other numbers. So I think those things can be really helpful as we look about to recognize that these kind of blanket statements and generalizations usually aren't that helpful, and we need to learn to deal with the individual.
I think
Yeah,
oh, go on, Ray.
I was just gonna say I would agree, like personality assessments can be helpful in helping appreciate the differences of others. Of course, Abram said they can have their detriments when you make it your identity. But it's true that realizing people are different, and that's okay, can really help, particularly those who don't fit the masculine stereotype and stuff like that, helping people. I also wanted to loop back a little bit about like the progressive vision and stuff like that. I'm sure there's some people listening, if they made it this far, and that would say, "Oh, you're just borrowing left-wing talking points or something like that." That these masculine things are really biblical ideas, and might point to certain Bible stories and stuff for that. And to that, I would say, like, sure, we're flawed. We don't have the magic vision for what men should be in every situation. All that. It's not what we're trying to say. But uh, the common saying in many is orthopraxy. Orthodoxy. The right belief will lead to the right practice. And in many of our churches, we see, abuse and sexual addiction and things like that presenting to them. And I think if we believe that true right belief leads to right practice, we should look at, like, where is our theology wrong, or maybe it's just a little misguided, that we could that we could adjust it, and not hold on to things as a sacred thing, like we can't touch the way things are done. We also don't need to go in and flip tables and change everything. But recognizing, saying there's nothing we can improve is in fact, I would say, a pretty arrogant view to have. If I'm going to sit here and say, oh, I know how all things ought to be, that'd be similarly arrogant, and I hope I don't come across that way. Also wanted to make clear to any young men who are listening to us, the fact that people find men like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate and stuff, like, their vision somewhat appealing. It's not a bad thing that you want to learn how to be a man, or to use your energy, your strength, and things like that. That is a great thing. What we're trying to encourage is to look to the Jesus example, the example of the sum of the law and the prophets. Basically, the sum of the Bible is to love one another, and including loving enemies and things like that. And that loving enemies can be something that is a lot harder than many other masculine things that we are presented with many times.
Yeah, I think a lot of this does boil down to kingdom theology. Like, a lot of the problems in the sort of Christian confusion is when we take the Roman order and the Roman ideology and we sort of try to mesh it into Christianity, which has been done for a long time, but there have always been people throughout history who have sort of resisted that and held fast to, hey, Jesus's example is very different from Caesar's, and we cannot be trying to mesh them together into one thing. We will end up with like a confused theology that does more harm than good if we want to have the fruit of the Spirit on one hand, and we also want to idolize militarism and conquering and all that on the other. It just doesn't. You're gonna have to choose one or the other, and usually when there's a syncretism, like, it's not Jesus as the center that wins out in that kind of case. I mean, all of us, we all grew up under the shadow of empire. I grew up in a colonized society where, in fact, people mainly say, oh, there's so many benefits to this. We're kind of a little ahead because we're more colonized. Like, I grew up in that kind of culture where that's the norm, where imperialism is kind of the value. Or in in say a capitalist society where wealth and success are the ideal. We all grow up entangled in empire. We're only just starting to realize how much Jesus changes that, how much the kingdom of God comes in to transform that. So I thought we could close by talking about like what are some of the closing thoughts you guys have on masculinity, or what would you like to share with maybe any men or any women who are listening? What this discovery of thinking about masculinity in terms of the gospel of peace has to offer us.
Yeah, one of the questions you had kind of out as a kind of an outline, you had said, what message of hope can Christians offer young men who are feeling disenfranchised, lost, and hopeless? And I just want to say, like, to somebody who says, wow, that describes me, like lost, hopeless, a lack of purpose. Like, I mean, yeah, definitely one of them would be like, hey, read these books that we've been talking about. But maybe you're not a reader. Well, you can listen to the audiobooks, or you can listen to other podcasts where these authors were interviewed. But I think also, like, just practical things, like you might not be somebody who finds it easy to have a conversation, especially about these type of things. And maybe you can say, you could find somebody that you think, hey, I'd like to know this person more, or I would, this might be somebody who I feel somewhat safe around. And you can say, hey, I listened to this podcast recently where they were talking about how, loneliness is fueling so much of this disenfranchisement that we see with men, and what are some ways, we can help men be less lonely. And I think it's not easy sometimes to be vulnerable and to say, hey, like that described to me. I've been feeling really lonely, and do you have like any advice? But it can also just be something like, something I got into last fall was disc golf, and I'm not a very person that's very much into sports, but that's the one sport that I've gotten into, and it's been a lot of fun. It's a great way for me to hang out with other guys and have a connection where, yeah, we're not sitting down and talking about vulnerable things, or talking about, you could say, very personal things. Sometimes we get on those subjects, but it's been a great way to just connect with guys. And yeah, for somebody like me who's an Enneagram 4, who would really, like, I live for those kind of deep conversations. It is tough. Other men, it's harder to connect with other men, and and so and or women. Um, and I think so. It's to connect with other people. It's not. It's kind of hard sometimes, but at the same time, I think as I've found um, different ways. Like one of them is through I'm visiting a local bookstore, and I've now become friends with the owners, and we do things together. They're a young married couple. They're my age, but they're newlyweds, so they married like a year ago, and we've been doing a lot of things together, and things that I enjoy and they enjoy it. And so I think there's different ways we can find that community that we need, whether it's through a sports or whether it's through something else, a shared passion, shared goal. Talking to somebody at church and having that tough conversation about, hey, I've been feeling really kind of distant from the people at my church, and I'd like to, explore ways to help, help with that, and kind of build some of those relationships. Whatever it is, like I feel for you if that describes you, and I hope that you can find some insight, and just, I think as you do that, and as you find those healthy friendships with other men, and you can have some of these discussions, and I think that's going to go a long way into being more healthy in your own life, whether that is because of sexual addiction, loneliness, isolation, shame. Like, I think a big thing for me is like when I was at the heights kind of this self-loathing and this shame, was the idea that nobody wants to hang out with me, or nobody wants to be around me. And again, that was me projecting that on other people. But I think getting around other people and realizing, oh, these people actually enjoy spending time with me. And that took some self I would say that took some work on my own part of realizing like, hey, I've maybe been a jerk to people around me, so I need to quit doing that. Or I've been argumentative, and I need to quit doing that. Like that's not leading to healthier relationships. So there's going to be times where it takes some self reflection and going, okay, have I been too argumentative? Have I been a jerk to people? Maybe that's why they don't want to be around me. But at the same time, like I think sometimes just kind of small ways to reach out and to start that journey. Like I think you'll be surprised how many other people are willing to come alongside you. And whether it's more emotionally or whether it's just something with sports, or maybe it's not as vulnerable as, there's different ways you can do that. But I'd say, there's hope out there. That's kind of the message I want to send.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, if you're a man and yeah, you're the type that feels like other men are too much the stereotype. They don't want to talk about their feelings, that type of thing. Yeah, you might be surprised if you take the initiative and share something. And you'll probably have to build a relationship. And before most men feel comfortable, most people don't like just sitting down and sharing their deepest secrets. Yeah, and yeah, that to just encourage people to be a little more open where they feel safe. You don't have to, share everything all at once and stuff like that. On the flip side, if you're like the very masculine man, like you feel like, and you see other people that you feel aren't very manly, that are sort of quiet, and you might perceive them as withdrawn or passive or something like that, maybe recognize that they're struggling with what Abram was saying. They would like to be friends, they would like to, but they feel insecure about themselves and stuff like that. And they would probably be willing to hear of your struggles, which might be very different from theirs. So I think, within the church, I just being willing to be the person to be more open can be a message. I also just, yeah, sort of want to reiterate what I said earlier, that if you feel like masculinity in the church isn't ideal, that's probably because it isn't. But yeah, instead of looking to Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, they've certainly got some helpful things to say, varying levels of the reason they appeal. We shouldn't judge people for being drawn to that, because there is some truth mixed in there. I feel like many of those have significant negatives that come along with it, and therefore I would encourage other things, other that we could. And I think that's sort of on the church to provide examples of masculinity for people to follow, whether or not they meet the masculine stereotype. Yeah, I guess in conclusion, I just sort of like to Paul laid out in Galatians, where he's talking about Christ has set us free. In Galatians 5, he's saying the whole law is fulfilled in one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour another, watch out, or you'll be consumed by one another. He's talking about the works of the flesh are obvious, and I think some of this is what could be described as toxic masculinity, sexual immorality, promiscuity, idolatry, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambitions, dissensions, factions, drunkenness, carousing, anything similar. He's warning them about those things, and yeah, those are the things that I feel are toxic masculine things sometimes, and or as Paul is presenting here, it's a common human problem. But then also what he's saying the fruit of the Spirit is, and this applies to everyone: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And I think that is a positive vision of masculinity. It's not the feminine fruits of the Spirit, it's the fruits of the Spirit. They include gentleness, like being thoughtful and being caring for people, and um, that I feel is the positive vision of what Jesus' kingdom is the fruits of the Spirit.
That is really impactful. And I just had like a thought that, what's happening in a lot of settings now is that people are realizing that there is this need to create safe spaces for guys to talk about things like struggles with pornography and things like that. I know there's a rise of mentoring, accountability groups, and I think there is a role for all these things. Spaces that you can be safe, can be vulnerable, and if you don't have that, it really would be advisable. It would be really great to seek that out, to look for mentors, to look for maybe your pastor, an older like couple in the church, people that you can really talk to and who also share their vulnerabilities and their struggles with you, and you can build each other up. I know like accountability groups can be really amazing for guys and for women as well. The other thought that I have is that we really need to have more brother-sister relationships in the church. I've been really blessed to have guys like you guys and as friends, and sometimes I think women don't realize sometimes when it comes to things like relationships that guys can feel a lot of fear, a lot of shame, lack of self-confidence, and it can really make a difference if you have, I think, a female friend that really encourages you to be you can encourage each other in your struggles, and because it helps to have just another. That's why we need one another. It helps to have another perspective. I know with guy friends sometimes, like recently I have encouraged two different ones to like reach out, encourage them to say, you are a really great person, maybe you should talk to that girl, or maybe you should pursue that relationship. You that encouragement, and it has worked out really well. And I think there is that role that we can play, encouraging one another as brothers and sisters. So thank you guys for sharing so much from the different books. We'll put all the links to all these different resources and books in the description for the podcast. And we hope to have many more conversations on this subject in future episodes. Thank you, Abram and Ray. And I'll see all of you again for the next episode of the Gospel of Peace.